All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. We are going to jump into lesson three. Lesson three, this is actually the second time I've recorded this video because I didn't like how I did it the first time. Lesson three is very heavy. There's a lot of really uncomfortable information in this lesson. We have to learn about uncomfortable things so that we understand what happened and we don't do it again. And so that is where we're at as we dive into lesson three. We set the stage really with that with Henry Friedenbach's. This book is meant to kind of set the stage as an opener for you as you dive into this lesson, and for me to teach this lesson. I don't like teaching this lesson. I don't like this part of our history, but again, we have to know what happened in the past so that we can clarify our present. And then your collaborative practice is going to be a book that I have found online. Actually, a friend has shared it with me. It's called Unspoken, and it doesn't have any words, but it's going to be of a white girl helping on the Underground Railroad. And so we're really looking at the life of enslaved and freed blacks in this lesson. We're looking at discrimination, what that means, and how that set the stage for the Civil War. And so we are going to look at some really uncomfortable topics today. So I want you to make sure your mind is right, your heart is right. We've got clear eyes and open hearts as we walk in. So we're going to analyze, again, slavery in different parts of the United States. We're typically staying in the South in this lesson. We're going to compare the effects of political, economic, and social factors on enslaved and free blacks. And we're going to look at a new Supreme Court case, Dred Scott versus Stanford, and how it affects life, mostly for enslaved and freed blacks. So our first thing we're going to look at is just life. Enslaved and free blacks formed families and communities, and they're very, very, very active in religious functions. They're going to fight back strongly against dehumanization. And so discrimination is kind of the leading into, or maybe the definition of dehumanization. When we dehumanize someone, we make them less than a person. And so discrimination is what is going to drive this idea. And so this definition I'm going to read verbatim is uncomfortable. As a race can be associated with slavery, the idea that blacks were an inferior race was used to justify discrimination against both enslaved persons and freed blacks. And so as a race becomes associated with slavery, the way that white people are going to justify or rationalize the idea of enslaving a person is to discriminate against them. And so let's kind of look at what that looks like. First, there was violence. So in the South, for enslaved blacks, violence was inflicted upon them by their owners. But it's not just in the South. We have to understand that. So freed blacks experienced violence as well. Their homes and schools and their churches were burnt down, and there was segregation. Segregation is separating whites and blacks, and so they could not be in the same school, the same areas. We're going to really look at this word segregation when we get into Reconstruction because it becomes law. This is just more of a practice at this time, but it actually becomes law during Reconstruction. But there also, remember, there's just a lot going on at this time. We've got the Irish immigrants, German immigrants that are being discriminated against as well. But then we're going to see Irish immigrants and freed blacks are actually going to have conflict with each other in those northern states for about 20 years. And so our immigrants and freed blacks are fighting against each other too. But there is resilience and there is resistance. So we have looked at a few slave rebellions, but we haven't looked at Nat Turner. So Nat Turner is going to try to orchestrate or create a slave rebellion. An enslaved black named Nat Turner is going to lead an enslaved rebellion that kills 50 white citizens. It is resistance. Again, it's violence. Enslaved blacks resisted. I think this is so fascinating. I didn't know this until I started really teaching U.S. history. They would, those that were enslaved would actually do things on the plantations to slow work down, like disabling their machinery, even destroying crops. And so I was like, well, that's clever. I didn't even think about that. But then we see slaves running away as well, enslaved people. That is going to be your Underground Railroad for the most part. And we see freed blacks serving as conductors. We also see them publicly speaking. We had Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass that are speaking out against the horrors of slavery. You have Harriet Tubman, who is fighting back by being one of the most famous conductors of the Underground Railroad. But we also see whites fighting back as well. William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Beecher Stowe are all white people that are fighting back against the idea of dehumanizing a person under the ideas of slavery. This is not in your notes. You have like a political section to fill in, and what is important is that you're going to fill in the pink spots, but I felt like it was important for you to know all of this. And so when we look politically at freed blacks in the North and enslaved blacks in the South, free blacks, we think they have all of these rights, but they don't. So this is kind of a timeline of their right to vote being taken away. So by 1807, black men could not vote in New Jersey. And by 1821, property requirements were enacted in order to vote if you were a black male, so that property requirement. By 1838, the vote is taken away in Pennsylvania. And then we're going to look at the Dred Scott decision on its own side, but it's going to make a clear statement that free blacks were not considered citizens of the United States. And then on the right side, we have our enslaved blacks, and it's basically nothing. They could not testify in court against a white person. They couldn't make a contract. That means like a legally binding agreement. They could never leave the plantation without permission. They couldn't own a firearm. They were forbidden to learn to read and write. And so this is what our differences are between the North and the South, but we still see a strong, strong sense of discrimination on both sides. Economically, free blacks were allowed to own land or acquire land. So in the North, they were allowed to own land. Men had found a career in the military, and so that's where a lot of our free blacks are going to work. They're going to find their careers there in the military, in the U.S. Navy, and in the Marines. Women living in the cities often worked as washwomen or domestic servants, seamstress, or they were running boarding houses. But again, they weren't working these high-paid jobs that were like a white person could have. Your enslaved blacks in the South, they are considered property. So they were sold just like cows or wagons or any other good that you would sell. And they are laboring on large plantations. So they can't own land. They can't have a business. They can't work in a business. And so, again, some of our differences between the North and the South. And then socially, it's not any better. So freed blacks in the North, their living conditions were deplorable. Deplorable means just horrific in the northern states. They really didn't have the money to pay for a nice living environment, so they lived in attics or cellars, small spaces. And then again, the enslaved blacks in the South, they lived on the plantation. And as we saw from Henry Box, those families were a lot of times broken up. You could be married if your master agreed to it, but that doesn't mean he wasn't going to sell your family like we saw in Henry Freedom Box. And then the Dred Scott case. So this is our fourth Supreme Court case that we're going to see. Dred Scott was an enslaved black man, but he was taken to the North with his owner and then back into the South. When his owner died, Scott sued for his freedom, given that at one point in his life he was on free ground in the North. Chief Justice Roger Taney, he'd be the head of the Supreme Court, kind of the top guy of the Supreme Court. Here's our really important point. It's going to be the ruling from him. The first thing he rules, based on the law, is that slaves of African descent are not citizens and cannot sue. So slaves are property. If you are of African descent, you are not considered a citizen in the United States, and you cannot sue for anything because you are not a citizen, but that of property. And so that's kind of where I said even freed blacks would fall under this because they are of African descent. And so even freed blacks were not considered citizens of the United States. The second point that he makes kind of subconsciously is that this makes the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because it limits the area slavery is allowed in. And so the Missouri Compromise limits slavery to north of that 3630 parallel and right here. And so, so all of this should be free, but with his ruling, he is basically saying that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. So therefore, the government would allow slavery to spread. This is huge. So his ruling is saying slavery can go wherever it wants to go. All of our compromises are nullified now, especially the Missouri Compromise. And if you are of African descent, you are not a citizen. So this is going to be a huge spark for abolitionist movement. Again, remember we saw the Fugitive Slave Law is bringing those abolitionists in further, and now this is going to be a huge spark that's going to really divide the United States in half. All right, that is it. You are now going to watch a silent book reading, but I do have questions for you, so please make sure that you are paying attention as you're watching. Thinking back on Henry's Freedom Box and how Unspoken is different and the same from that.